I'd like for us to begin by just taking a moment to reflect on the impacts of the opioid epidemic, be that in your own personal life, the life of a loved one or a friend, or perhaps just the community you live in. Now imagine you're a substance abuse counselor who works in a drug rehabilitation center, and one day while you're at work, you're reflecting on just how beautiful and how powerful it is to see people recover from substance use disorder, to achieve and obtain a life of sobriety. And you think to your own fiance's recovery and how powerful it is seeing the man that he has become in sobriety. And as you reflect with gratitude on the process and experience that you have had with him and the life that you share today, and that the life that you're now going to be able to bring your son into this world to experience, your phone rings. Your partner has relapsed, and as a result of this relapse, he has suffered a fatal overdose. Over the coming hours, days, weeks, and months as you navigate through this grieving process, you begin to experience this strange sense of judgment, guilt, and shame as you talk about the manner in which your beloved passed away. You begin to experience stigma that is often intertwined with substance use disorder. Through the statements of judgment about your fiance's passing, you feel as though your grieving process itself is being judged. You hear things along the lines of, well, you're a counselor. If anyone should have the tools to navigate this process, it ought to be you. And this brings a new sense of stigma towards your grieving process itself. So there is a unique way in which stigma inflicts itself upon grief, especially when it is compounded by the stigma associated with substance use disorder, or for those who have passed away from a fatal overdose. So I became interested in this topic when I too had lost a loved one to an overdose. I was in a long-term relationship with somebody who was sober, and their first time using was also their last. So I got thrown into this tumultuous process of grief. But with that, I started to experience this sense of stigma, of judgment about the manner in which they had passed away. And so often when we talk about the opioid epidemic and substance use disorder, we focus on harm reduction for those who are afflicted with substance use disorder. And left out of this discussion is commonly the families who are left behind. So in today's talk, I will discuss the research I've done on the families who have left behind. So the tale of the counselor I just gave is not merely a colorful illustration, but the experience of a strong, powerful woman who we will call Susan. I met Susan through doing interviews for my doctoral dissertation on individuals who had lost a loved one to a fatal overdose. And the key thing that Susan and many others expressed through our time together is that they really experienced this sense of stigma after losing a loved one. So stigma, in the words of sociologist Erving Goffman, is blemishes of individual character perceived as weak will, domineering or unnatural passions, treacherous and rigid beliefs, dishonesty. In other words, what Goffman is really saying is that stigma is when we view something about somebody else as not normal, right? Often people who experience stigma are stereotyped and experience prejudice and discrimination as a result of these social stigmas. One example we can readily turn to is if we think of the experience of individuals who had AIDS during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. So we know that a social stigma is a discrediting characteristic, attitude, or behavior that is placed on someone and is viewed as negative, which in turn otherizes the individual from what is deemed as normal. And so Susan felt that her grief was judged by others, that it was not accepted, that it was not normal, right? And Nancy Burns, who gives an amazing TED Talk, talks about how closure itself is a social construct, right? That we as a society, since the 90s, have really pushed this idea that grief is something that should be overcome, that we should readily and easily move through it and achieve and obtain this sense of closure. And part of this comes from the fact that death in our society is rather taboo. So because of this taboo nature of death, we view it as something that grief is then something we ought to overcome. And so when individuals are grieving, they're bearing a mark of feeling different from those around them, and especially when they're continuing to grieve. We also know that there's a stigma around substance use disorder. Specifically, regardless of the American Medical Association classifying substance use disorder as a brain disorder in the 60s, there is still a prevalent view within our society that addiction is an individual choice or a matter of weak will. One of the women I interviewed spoke on this perfectly when she said, quote, "My brother did not want to be an addict. He really didn't. And my son doesn't want to be an addict, this is killing people, these people don't want to die, but my anger flares when basically I think that people think that, when these people that don't get it, when they feel like addicts deserve death, that's what gets me," end quote. And, so we see that one of the problems that this stigma of addiction has brought on the bereaved is seen through the process of them trying to get their loved one help, right? A lot of the parents I spoke to really experienced a sense of stigma regarding addiction when they were trying to get their loved one into a treatment center, noting that they felt that they were navigating this process alone. And that feeling, a lot of them expressed, carried into their grieving process. That they felt because of the stigma associated with substance use disorder, that others didn't get it then. How could they get it now as they're grieving? And there was also the stigma associated with the financial pressures that these individuals were feeling in seeking to get their loved one help. That maybe they couldn't afford it and they felt guilt and shame because of that in the wake of their loved one passing. And so we can see that stigma is then really playing a part in this grieving process in two ways. First is there's the stigma associated towards one's own grief during this process. And second is the stigma associated towards the loved one's addiction. So this brings us to a very important question. How does the stigma impact the way in which the bereaved grieve and process through their loss? So to answer that question, it's important that we look at some of the general terms of grief and how grief has been conceptualized prior. First, there's this idea of anticipatory grief. And this is when an individual experiences grief or loss through a loss that they could anticipate, right? Think of a terminal disease, when they know that the end is near, they know that the end is approaching, and so this loss itself is anticipated, and therefore the grieving process itself becomes anticipated. Then there is sudden loss, which is similar to what I had experienced, where there's no warning signs. You just get a call one day, and somebody you love and care about is gone. But neither of these two terms really capture or explain the type of grief that I was seeing through these interviews talking with people. And so this is where I coined the term stigmatized grief. And this is where stigma is compounded with and complicates the grieving process. So this stigma often leads people to blame themselves for their loved one's death. And this shame, coupled with the judgment experienced from others, acts as a barrier to help-seeking behaviors. So I have found that those who become involved in support groups after losing a loved one, and who actively seek to understand that substance use disorder is a disease, display less complications associated with unresolved grief. And why is this? They begin to break down that stigma, both of their grief by finding other individuals who are navigating that process alongside them, with them, but also against addiction by finding like-minded individuals who understand that process. Those who do not have this support or who deeply feel a sense of judgment towards their grief often experience a lot of complications from their grief. Some of the parents that I interviewed expressed that in navigating this grief, they've now have health complications. They've developed autoimmune diseases. One mother, in a powerful statement, said that ever since she lost her loved one, it feels as if she's just experiencing a traumatic brain injury. And also they all were experiencing a sense of isolation. They felt others didn't understand or couldn't understand what they were going through. And so this really shows that the impacts of stigma on grief are very real. And this complicates our understanding of grief in two ways, right? So if we think of sudden loss, first and foremost, and we combine that with stigmatized grief, the bereaved voice that they have often felt confusion, anger, guilt, and anger towards their loved one, while simultaneously battling with the understanding that substance use disorder is a disease and not a choice, which ended their loved one's life. Second, when someone experienced the anticipatory loss coupled with stigmatized grief, they voiced that they experienced guilt for the relief that they felt in light of their loved one passing, and that they felt a sense of helplessness and failure for not being able to cure or save their loved one in that time. So this shows that our understanding of grief really needs to be expanded when we're thinking of grief in the wake of the opioid epidemic, as does our compassion. So all voiced the importance of support. They voiced the importance of educating people on substance use disorder, the importance of this peer support and access to treatment for those who are afflicted with substance use disorder, as well as support for the families who are trying to get a loved one help. But more importantly, all these families left me with a call, which is what I wish to share with you today. Their call has been one of ending the stigma surrounding addiction and eradicating the stigma surrounding grief. One way to do this is to acknowledge the systematic barriers in treatment, and that individuals did not receive the help they needed, not because of a personal failing or lack of support or bad parenting, but rather because of the pervasive stigma that still surrounds substance use disorder. Lastly, grief is not neat. It is not linear, and it is not scripted. Hold space for those who are navigating this process and who will continuously be navigating this process. More than anything, I have found that these individuals need a space where they can feel that they are heard, where their loved ones' stories are heard, where they have a space that they feel safe to share their story. So the three things I request in closing. First, listen compassionately by meeting them where they're at, rather than voicing where you believe they should be in their process. Second, listen openly by providing them a safe space to share their grief, to share their story, to share their loved one's story. And third, listen without judgment, without judging grief, without judging substance use disorder.